Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, previewing Naz Reid and Dante DiVincenzo's seasons with the Wolves. How will Naz's role shift in the absence of Karl-Anthony Towns, and what can the Wolves expect from Dante DiVincenzo? How exactly will he fit in their rotation as well? It's all coming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beacon. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is sponsored by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy Hump Day and happy Timberwolves game day. Preseason game number, 4 tonight? 4 of 5 as the Wolves are in Chicago to take on the Bulls. Today, though, we're previewing a couple key pieces of the Timberwolves bench unit. We've gotten most of the way through, about halfway through the roster itself, a little more than halfway. Today, we're going to talk Naz Reid. We're going to talk Dante DiVincenzo. And then we'll get into the starters the first part of next week leading into the season. But I want to talk about Naz's role, like how that could shift, what we know based on his minutes last year, the lineups he was in, and the success the Wolves saw with him on the floor, what that could mean this year about the rotation, and what, some goals for Naz this season should be, and also Dante DiVincenzo's fit with the Wolves as well, where he falls in the rotation, lineups I'm most excited to see him with, etc. So, a big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All right. So we've been going through this player preview series, and what I like to do is just kind of give an overall expectation for each player on the roster, what their role is going to be, how they fit. With someone like Naz, who we know a great deal about already. We've seen him play in Minnesota now for 5 seasons. He really had kind of his, obviously, breakout last year. You could argue a couple seasons ago before the contract, but then last year he actually wins Sixth Man of the Year. So we know what he can offer. But I want to dig a bit on a couple numbers. I want to talk about some lineup data, and also what's the next frontier for Naz. I mean, Naz is still he just turned 25 this summer. There's still upside there for Naz Reid. So I want to talk about all that here today. The obvious when it comes to Naz is as he's gotten opportunity, he's just continued to excel. Right. 2 years ago, he averaged 18 minutes per game, and he earned himself that 3-year deal, which this is now going to be year 2 of the 3-year deal, and year 3 is a player option. So this is effectively a contract year for Naz Reid. Actually, and also we'll talk about this next week, but Julius Randle too. Both Naz and Julius Randle have player options for next year. So prior to the Cat trade, on this show, I talked about how, look, unless they trade Cat, they can't keep Naz because he's going to play his way into a bigger contract going into his prime. Remember, that's why this deal made sense for him to take less years and money to stay in Minnesota. And there were, reports that was the case because it was essentially a 2-year deal where he's got some protection. If something goes wrong this year, he shouldn't play less, right? Because Cat's gone, but say he gets hurt or something, he can always opt into next year and play on that in his age 26 season. But otherwise, he becomes a free agent just before he turns 26 at what should be really his athletic prime, kind of the sweet spot for like, hey, 6 years in the league, but I'm still only 26 years old, and be able to get a massive contract in free agency. And now the Wolves at least have a shot at retaining him, assuming he does opt out. And if he progresses like he has each of the last 2 seasons, that's very likely what's going to happen. Last season, Naz played in 81 of 82 games. He started 14 when Karl-Anthony Towns got hurt. Of course, Kyle Anderson started some of the time, with Finch preferring to keep Naz Reid out with the bench unit, but ultimately he did end up starting 14 games. He averaged 24 minutes per game, which was 5 minutes more than he'd averaged in any other season in his career to this point. 13.5 points, 5 rebounds per game. Shot just under 48% from the field, which is, just actually a little below his league average. The volume was a bit up for him, his career average. Volume was up a bit for him. Straight raw field goal percentage doesn't tell us a whole lot. 41% on 3-point attempts. His previous career high was 35%. So this is the big question. Naz has this reputation of being this true stretch four, and like people talk about him like he's the same shooter as Karl-Anthony Towns, and I get it. We all love Naz. That has not been the reality of Naz Reid, which was part of my concern before the Wolves gave him this contract, about a year and a half ago. Through the first 4 seasons of his career, he only was a 34.4% three-point shooter, which is below league average at this point. 34.4%. And just under 3 attempts per game. Last season, he shot 5 attempts per game and was 41.4% outside the arc. His three-point rate was nearly 50%. It was 48%. His previous career high was, as a rookie, 40%. Other than that, 38%. He never shot more than 40% of his field goal attempts in a season from outside the arc, and last year he was 48%. So nearly half of his field goal attempts were threes. He got to the line far less than in any other season. I have some now. Let me be really clear. Naz is fantastic. Naz is he's going to have a strong season. If there's areas to pay attention to, is there any sort of regression to the mean in terms of his 3-point shooting? On yesterday's show, Tuesday's show, I did the last segment on Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and I pointed out that through Nikhil's first 4 years, he was a below league average 3-point shooter. But now we've got 2 years of data that suggests he's a 38-ish to 39% above league average 3-point shooter. Yeah, he struggled in the playoffs, but that's only 16 games. The last 2 seasons, and the point I made is, hey, look, it's likely a player is going to improve over the course of his career, and shooting's an area that certainly there can be a trend line that improves. Nickeil, I believe a little more in that improvement because he did it for 2 full seasons. Now, Naz, well, he increased volume and percentage last year. He's got to do it another year. Nearly half his shots were from outside the arc, and he made 41% of them. And I'll say it again, he had never shot north of 35%, 35.1% in any other season in his career, and had been only 34.5% the 2 years prior to last year. So is the 40+% three-point shooter Naz, is that what he is now? Because if he plays like he did last year, but continues to improve, then he's an absolute steal for the contract he's on, and he's going to get a huge deal next summer. That's the question, though, is that three-point shooting for real? Is he really a 40% three-point shooter? Because of that, even though he shot the ball a little bit worse from 2, the effective field goal percentage was in the same neighborhood as it had been the year prior. And the true shooting percentage, same deal for Naz Reid. I mentioned the free throw rate. That was way down because he just got to the rim less often. Like if you look at where he shot from, every other season, at least a third of his shot attempts were coming from within 3 feet of the basket. This year it was only 21%. So he went from basically a third to a fifth of his field goal attempts, I should say, coming within 3 feet of the basket. I don't know how much of that is. A couple reasons for it. One, he played more with Rudy Gobert, obviously, and did it early in his career. So he's playing a lot more at the 4. He even played a little bit at the 3 this last year. So that's certainly part of it, is he was just on the perimeter more. He was playing in the post less often. Rudy was in the paint more. There was less space on the court, period, and Naz was being asked to provide the space. And then the other thing that crosses my mind, and I could be completely off base with this, but remember how he broke his wrist late in the season in 22-23 when he wasn't able to play in the playoffs, was Naz loves to dunk on guys. He loves to throw it down, and he likes to challenge people at the rim. Is there any level? I never saw any evidence last year of him shying away from contact, although sometimes I kind of wish he would. Is that playing in the back of his mind? We're like, hey, I could go to the rim and try and yam on somebody and break something again, or I could just shoot a 3 where I'm 40+%. Thankfully, Naz isn't about to shoot any mid-range jumpers. We know that about Naz. That's never been a concern. So if the attempts at the rim are coming at the expense of 3-point attempts, we can handle that. So I'm not, pulling a fire alarm on that one. I just think it's notable that the free throw rate went way down. If you want to look at it as, per game terms, it's very similar because the minutes played were so much higher. He played 6 more minutes per game and only attempted 0.1 free throw attempts less. But if you actually look at the rate, it's way down. Or if you want to look at like per 36, would be another way to say that. He attempted 1 less free throw per 36 minutes, which is significant. So that's something to keep an eye on is what's the shot selection look like for Naz. I want to talk about some of the lineup data next and what I think his role will be within the rotation for Minnesota this year. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. Hey, fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. If you're an NFL fan, there's, of course, lots of action this week. The Thursday night game is, Spencer Rattler's New Orleans Saints against, I almost said Dacian Nix, Bo Nix's Denver Broncos. It's a basketball podcast after. It's a Timberwolves podcast. Of course, I've got Dacian Nix on the brain. Broncos at Saints on Thursday night. The Saints are 2.5-point underdogs at home with their backup quarterback playing, their young quarterback playing. I don't know. I actually don't hate the Saints in this one. I know the Broncos have a good defense, but I don't know. I always like the paying attention to the primetime games on FanDuel because it's the only show in town. There's 2 Monday night games this upcoming Monday, and also this upcoming Tuesday is the start of the NBA season for the regular season. So plenty to get into there. When it comes to, individual games, we talked about win totals. The Timberwolves are still hanging right around that 52.5. I think they're still at 52.5. There is a line right now for next Tuesday, by the way. Wolves at Lakers. Minnesota's favored by 2.5 points on the road against LeBron and the Lakers next Tuesday night. Crazy. When you get a hunch in the middle of a game, NBA, NFL, whatever it might be, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet over at FanDuel. Again, that's FanDuel.com. All right, let's talk Naz Reid lineup. So we talked a bit about lineups back around the time of the trade because there was there's a lot of processing to be done when the Wolves make a trade of this magnitude at this time of the year, especially. And there's some discussion about like, hey, well, Naz can play with Rudy and Naz minutes with Rudy were solid and all that. And it's true they were. They weren't as good as Karl-Anthony Towns minutes with Rudy last year. And I made that point on the show right after the trade as part of my initial reaction, not liking the trade. Of course, I've also made the case since then about why it could be a positive thing because we don't really know, right? There's pros and there's cons. My initial reaction is, I'll say this briefly now, I do think the ceiling of the team is lower without Karl-Anthony Towns. I do think it also works basketball wise. My preference would have been to have Karl-Anthony Towns on the team from a ceiling standpoint, but I'm really excited to watch Julius Randle and Donte DiVincenzo this season. And I've spent a lot more time on DiVincenzo recently. And also today we will. But we'll talk about Julius Randle early next week as well. We haven't actually seen Randle in a Timberwolves uniform yet, although we're supposed to tonight in Chicago, by the way. So anyway, last season, Rudy and Naz on the floor with no Karl-Anthony Towns played nearly 1,800 possessions, 1,784 possessions. They're a plus 8.4 net rating, which is an 89th percentile unit. Now, interestingly, Rudy and Naz units were 99th percentile on defense, which maybe shouldn't be. It's interesting. It's not shocking because Rudy defensive units are always good, but they were only 31st percentile offensively. Just shy of 2/3 of those minutes were played with Anthony Edwards on the floor. So we still got 600 plus possessions of Rudy and Naz with no Cat or Ant on the floor. And those possessions were not as successful as you might expect. Now, I think we're going to see this season, there's no question Julius Randle is going to start next to Rudy Gobert. I think there's a real shot that we see Naz Reid close games in place of Julius Randle or in place of Rudy Gobert. I think it depends on the matchup more than anything. It also could depend on if they're playing catch up or simply, if they have a lead that they're trying to protect. It's a lot more likely you see Rudy and Randle on the floor, not Naz. I think Julius Randle and Naz Reid are similar but different defenders, if you will. I think they'll have a similar impact, but it's going to depend on who the opponent is. But in a lot of cases, Julius Randle may actually be on the floor instead of Naz in those situations. If they need offense, you may see Naz and Randle and no Rudy. It's a real mix and match situation, just like it was last year. Although there's less of a clear line between Randle and Naz than there was between Cat and Naz. Naz was seen as a light version of Cat. It's not that simple, but there was no question what that pecking order should look like. Now you're talking about, Julius Randle was an all-star the last 2 years, but Naz won Sixth Man of the Year last year, and he's the incumbent. The fans love him. There's going to be pressure on Randle to perform, and I really do think it's going to be up to the matchups. And I think Randall's probably on the floor in crunch time most of the time because he's the most two-way play. I would argue, depending on the matchup, he could be better defensively than Naz. He's certainly better offensively than Rudy. So I think it's going to be a real mix and match situation from Chris Finch. This is oversimplifying it because the actual matchup's going to matter. But I do think if they're behind, you see Naz and Randall together in crunch time. If they're ahead, you see Rudy and probably Randall, maybe Naz. So while Naz will not start, I think the bench rotation, we're going to see him play quite a bit with Rob Dillingham and Donte DiVincenzo. I think that Naz playing with a dynamic guard that can push the pace is a good thing for Naz Reid. You look at Naz's two-man pairings last season. His best two-man pairing that was, we'll call it over a couple hundred minutes, I'm taking out TJ Warren, was Monte Morris, weirdly enough, a more traditional point guard. His next best was actually Rudy Gobert. So I talked about the success of Naz-Rudy lineups. Naz-Rudy lineups overall had a net rating of plus 9.2. Naz and Cat lineups had a net rating of plus 7. Naz's next best lineup was with Jordan McLaughlin. So 2 of his top 3 lineups were with more traditional diminutive type point guards who were going to find him in pick and pop situations with frequency in Monte Morris and Jordan McLaughlin. Next up was Anthony Edwards, and then Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and then Cat. So what's the moral of the story here? I don't know that there's a whole lot to glean from it. Oh, I should also say the only negative two-man pairings he had was Shake Milton, Troy Brown Jr. That's it. Only 200 minutes with Troy Brown and 332 with Shake Milton. But that, I think, has more to do or says more about the two guys who were jettisoned midseason anyway than it does about Naz Reid. But I think the Naz playing with a more traditional point guard or a dynamic point guard that can push the pace, in this case, Rob Dillingham, who is more of a combo guard, scoring guard. We talked about him extensively. I think it was Tuesday's show just yesterday. I spent time on him as a key member of the bench unit. The idea of Dillingham is he can play the traditional point guard role, but he's also a dynamic scorer that's going to push the pace and play make for him, for others, and also create for himself scoring opportunities. And I think that match with Naz will be pretty fascinating, Dillingham and Naz Reid. The last thing on Naz Reid is the rebound rate continues to kind of move in the wrong direction. And I know he played away from the rim more often last year. I'm less concerned about it than I had been because he's not really playing a whole lot of center anymore. But the offensive rebound rate used to be a pretty big thing for Naz. It's way down. It was down almost 2.5 points last year. The overall rebound rate was down almost 3 points last year. And so that's something to keep an eye on. Again, the role's shifting. I get it. But that's an area that the Wolves need to rebound all 5, especially when Rudy's not on the floor. So if they end up in these smaller lineups where Naz and Randall are on the floor together, Naz Reid's got to get in there and get dirty a little bit. He's got to get some boards. That's going to be important for Naz this year. I don't want to harp on it too much, but that's something to pay attention to. That's been kind of my biggest beef with him back when he mostly played center, was he just didn't quite rebound well enough. And that's something to keep an eye on. All right. Let's transition directly into Donte DiVincenzo. I spent a lot of time right after the trade on Donte, so I'll hit a couple of the overall profile things, like what he brings to the table first, and we'll talk a bit about rotation. Donte DiVincenzo, the way I described him kind of in the wake of this trade was he could be the swing piece in this trade. It's on the surface, it's replacing Cat with Randall, but it's really replacing elements of Cat's game with each of these two guys, and spread over Randall and DiVincenzo. It just gives the Wolves that much more depth. Like from a shooting perspective, Julius Randle, I know he was in the 3-point contest last year, but he's a volume below average actually in terms of, he's a volume 3-point shooter below average in terms of percentage. He's only had one above league average 3-point shooting season in his career. DiVincenzo is the guy who was third in the entire NBA in both takes and makes from outside the arc last season, behind only Steph Curry and Luka Doncic. He was nearly a 41% catch and shoot guy last year for the Knicks. He is the one who's going to swing this trade with, and also shore up the Wolves' outside shooting. When they trade one of the best shooters, period, in the entire league, DiVincenzo is the one that's kind of backfilling that. We've seen so far in preseason, on and off the ball, DiVincenzo can create. He's not a traditional point guard. He can run the offense, which is the same thing I've said about a couple other guys, Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Rob Dillingham, and you could say that about obviously Ant, right? Outside of Mike Conley, the Wolves don't deploy a traditional point guard. DiVincenzo's got the size of a two guard, closer to a two guard. He's got the mentality of a two guard, but he doesn't need the ball in his hands. He's perfectly fine playing off the ball, and he's such a dangerous catch and shoot player that the defense has to pay attention to him. But he can also create off the dribble, and that's something he didn't have early in his career in Milwaukee, or at least didn't showcase or wasn't given the opportunity to showcase. But he can score off the bounce a little bit. We saw him do it against the Knicks on Sunday. He can pump fake and drive and create for others or himself when he does drive. He's done it a bit more. And last year at the Knicks, he averaged 15.5 points per game, I believe. 15.5 points per game last season for the Knicks. He started 63 games for the Knicks. And even though he was a full-time starter for the Bucks back, 4 years ago, he only averaged 10 points per game, was 38% outside the arc. He's always been a solid three-point shooter, but it just wasn't the same. He now can do more off the dribble. There's more in his bag than there was when he was a 23, 24-year-old with the Bucks. He's now going to be 28 years old in a Timberwolves uniform. He turns 28 in January this year. And he's going to get every opportunity to create. And I want to dig into the rotation thing here in a minute. Actually, we could do that here next. And then I want to touch on a couple defensive things related to DiVincenzo as well, which is easily overlooked, but I think his hard-nosed mentality is going to add a lot to the Wolves defense as well. So we'll talk about that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors at Game Time. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play live even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Game Time Picks also will curate your selections to make it easier to save even more on all of the above. Any sort of sporting event or concert or comedy show, theater, whatever it might be, you can save more with Game Time Picks, and the curation will make it easier to do exactly that. You can also toggle on the all-in pricing feature, which allows you to see the total up front. So that way there's no surprise fees at checkout. Just make sure to toggle on the all-in pricing feature. You can also get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. The Game Time ticket coverage means that your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. All right, let's talk about DiVincenzo defensively before we get into rotation thoughts with him. DiVincenzo last season was 93rd percentile in steals created per 75 possessions. That graded out as an A over at B-Ball Index. He was 94th percentile in deflections per 75 possessions. Also grades out as an A. He was 62nd percentile in passing lane defense, which is defined by bad pass steals plus deflections that he causes in the passing lanes, which is a B-. But again, 62nd percentile, we'll take that. So the Timberwolves looked at DiVincenzo and they said, look, with the Knicks, you had to guard some of the best, toughest covers. Like I know they had Josh Hart. I know they had some of OG Anunoby. They had, there are good perimeter defenders with the Knicks. But the Timberwolves have probably the best mix of perimeter defenders in the entire league with Jaden McDaniels, Anthony Edwards, Nickeil Alexander-Walker off the bench. Even 37-year-old Mike Conley is a decent on-ball defender. I think the situation DiVincenzo's coming into is he's almost never going to have to be the guy guarding the primary ball handler at the point of attack. He may switch onto him. The Wolves will have that flexibility. He's capable of doing it. But he's not going to be asked to do quite as much as he had to do in New York. Plus, you have Rudy Gobert behind you. And yeah, Mitchell Robinson's great when he plays. But the Wolves are going to be set up to be an even better defense than the Knicks. The Timberwolves look at these numbers, what DiVincenzo does off the ball. They know he's an intelligent team defender. He's a good help defender. He knows where to be and when. He plays the passing lanes great. And they said, look, we have Jaden McDaniels putting pressure on the ball. We have Anthony Edwards putting pressure on the ball, like he did to Jalen Brunson on Sunday when he shut him down at the end of the shot clock. We have Nickeil Alexander-Walker pressuring Jamal Murray at the timeline like he did in Game 2 of the second round of the playoffs last year. How do we shore up the wings defensively? Shore up like they weren't amazing last year. We get a guy who's an awesome off-ball defender, one of the best off-ball defenders in the entire league. 94th percentile in deflections per 75 possessions. 93rd percentile in steals per 75 possessions. DiVincenzo is a smart, heady defender with the size to be effective when switched onto the ball, the athleticism to be effective both off the ball and on the ball. But he doesn't have to be on the ball. Last year in New York, he guarded the top two usage tiers, 88% of the time, the top usage tier, 97% of the time, 97th percentile guarding the second usage tier, 88th percentile guarding the top usage tier. He doesn't necessarily have to do that with the Wolves. He may some nights, and he will get switched onto them. That's all part of it. But the pressure won't quite be there because of Rudy Gobert, because of McDaniels and Ant and Alexander Walker. So they can add just another strong, not just solid, but well above average, one of the better off-ball defenders in the backcourt in the entire NBA. That profile fits perfectly with what the Wolves need and the personnel that they already have. That clearly was a big part of this. Rotation-wise, he's going to come off the bench. He was going to do that in New York this year anyway. But again, he started 63 games last season for the Knicks and came off the bench for the other 18. And there's a real chance that there's like Naz Reid potential here where he doesn't start the game, but he could finish it. Now, I don't know he's going to finish it ahead of, maybe Jaden. Probably not Mike Conley. So Chris Finch is going to have a good problem on his hands when it comes down to crunch time because you got your 5 starters who are your starters, and then you have the 6th man of the year, Naz Reid, and you have 2 of the best backcourt guards in the entire league off your defense, off your bench. I should say backcourt guards is redundant. 2 of the very best, bench pieces in the entire league coming off your bench, Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Donte DiVincenzo. So I think, again, it's going to depend on the night. I think Finch is going to play the matchups. I think he's going to ride the hot hand a little bit. If DiVincenzo plays like he has in the preseason, I don't know how you're keeping him off the floor at the end of the game. Maybe you just play small, and if you have a lead, or if you're behind, I should say, maybe McDaniels is on the bench, and you're just trying to get some, you have DiVincenzo out there with Ant and Mike Conley to try and generate some offense. If you have the lead, maybe you don't need DiVincenzo on the floor. Or maybe Mike Conley's not on the floor, and you're rolling DiVincenzo, Ant, and McDaniels if you need to have an ultra-aggressive defense and a bunch of guys that can shoot it. And there's real mix and match potential here for Chris Finch. And DiVincenzo gives you that luxury because he can play he can play both guard spots, but because he can guard really 3 positions and he is switchable and he is just a knockdown 3-point shooter. Again, he took the third most threes in the league last year, made the third most threes in the league last year, and was 40.1% from outside the arc, 41% essentially catch and shoot. He can play on the ball. He can play off the ball. He's a really versatile player overall. And on I haven't talked at all about the contract stuff, but on a steal of a deal for the next 3 years in Minnesota. So DiVincenzo is the perfect plug-and-play player because he can play with any team, but he fits. And I talked to you a little the other day about the mentality and the edge that he plays with. Clearly, we saw that at Madison Square Garden on Sunday, going at it with Tibbs and Rick Brunson. But he's a perfect fit and can do anything for this team. He's going to come off the bench. Finch will have the option to use him to close games. But and then also, I mentioned this the other day, and real quickly, the Wolves can call plays for DiVincenzo, use him as a movement shooter like they did back in the day with Malik Beasley early in Chris Finch's tenure. Like they've done at times with Mike Conley, at times with Ant, a little bit with Cat, recently with Naz, we've seen it. But DiVincenzo can get his shot off from anywhere, and he can move so well without the ball. I think we're going to see some creativity from Chris Finch to try and play around with different things he can do for DiVincenzo to get him the ball in advantageous places where he can get off a three-pointer, be open, and knock down a catch and shoot at 41%. All right. Moral of the story is the Timberwolves have a crazy deep bench. Like they have 8 guys that could start for basically any team in the league. I mentioned this on Tuesday's show, but it'd be fun to do a show like Wolves bench versus everyone else's or Wolves top 8 versus everyone else's. It's going to be hard to find a better one. It really is. All right. That's all we have for you today. The Timberwolves play tonight at the Bulls. They also play tomorrow night at home against, I think it's against Denver. Their only Target Center preseason game was moved up a day because of the Lynx playing in the WNBA Finals. Game 3 for the Lynx Wednesday night, game 4 at Target Center on Friday night. So Thursday is going to be a post-game pod. We'll pretty much only talk about Wednesday night's game. We'll do the same Friday about Thursday night's game, and then that's it for the preseason. Monday, Tuesday, and next week, we'll preview the starters. I'll give you my final predictions into next week, and then Tuesday night, it's showtime. The Wolves, well, not actually showtime Lakers, but the Wolves will take on the Lakers. Showtime in terms of the start of the season. Tuesday night in LA, we are within a week now, 6 days. Crazy. That's all we got for you today here on the show. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku or Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow at X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at B-Beacon with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, for your second listen, you can check out Locked On Fantasy Basketball. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. You can become a fantasy basketball expert and get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from Josh Lloyd. Find it on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, the last episode in the feed, if you haven't listened to it already, posted on Tuesday evening, was the preview for the top of the Western Conference. The Locked On NBA season previews are live on Locked On NBA. From the East and West contenders to potential tanking teams, a 6-episode series with everything you need to know about the NBA season. You can find it on Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Again, the episode that yours truly was on about the top of the West with the Suns, Lakers, Suns, I always forget. Suns, Lakers, Nuggets, Thunder, and the Wolves. I think that was it. And Mavs, of course. Go check that out. It's the last episode in your feed on wherever you're listening to this show. You can listen to that podcast we recorded just about a week and a half ago. So, obviously post trade and everything. So go check that out. A big thank you for making this show your first listen every day. And we'll be back tomorrow with the post game pod following Wolves Bulls. Once again, I'm Ben Beacon. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast. We'll catch you next time.